Welcome to this video, which will review the major bones of the adult skull. To do this, we'll be using the program Essential Anatomy 5. Let's start by looking at the front portion of the skull and what appears to be one large bone right here. And if we click on it, we can see it's highlighted in green, and this is the frontal bone. Frontal bone actually started off as separate bones, which then ossified and joined over time. If we look at the side of the skull, the lateral aspect of the skull, we can see that the large bone behind the frontal, and let's click on it, is the parietal. And the parietal is bilateral, so I'm going to rotate the skull, and we can see highlighted is the right parietal, and here is the left. And we can see that they join together in a mid-sagittal position. Now, as I work my way to the posterior aspect of the skull, I can see that here's a large bone, and we'll click on it and highlight it, and it is the occipital bone. And let's just rotate it so we can get a bit better view of it. Occipital bone is quite a large bone, makes up the posterior aspect of the skull, and also if I rotate, you can see that the occipital bone actually extends to the base of the skull, and you can even see that the occipital bone makes up the margins of the foramen magnum here. Moving again to the lateral aspect of the skull, we'll have a look at this other large bone, and this is the temporal bone. Temporal bone is quite a large bone, and you can see part of it actually extends forward, and this becomes part of the posterior aspect of the zygomatic arch. And here's this whole zygomatic arch. Now, right in front of the temporal bone is probably one of the most difficult bones to visualize because of its shape. And this is the sphenoid bone. What I'm going to do is rotate the skull, and the sphenoid bone is highlighted in green. So wherever you see green, that is part of the sphenoid bone. So we can see in the lateral aspect, we can see sphenoid. As we rotate, you can see in the eye sockets, there's sphenoid. And of course, the bone extends to the other side of the skull. And if I rotate and look at the posterior portion of the skull, you can see part of the base of the skull is also made of the sphenoid. To get a better view of the sphenoid or get a sense of its shape, I'm actually going to isolate it. So this is a really nice feature about this program. I've clicked on the isolate button, and now all we're looking at is the sphenoid itself. I'm going to rotate it so you can have a good look at its complex shape. Often the sphenoid's described as being butterfly-shaped, and you can see why. It looks as if it has these two lateral wings. This view would basically be from inside the skull looking down at the base, a lateral exterior view of the sphenoid, and this is a view of the sphenoid we'd have from the base of the skull looking upwards from the outside. Now, to see another view of the sphenoid, what I'm going to do is use another feature of this program, and I'm going to fade the other bones around it. And as we do, we can see the sphenoid in situ or in place. I'll just start with the lateral view. As I rotate, you can really get a sense the sphenoid is fairly deep into the bony structure of the skull, quite complex in shape. Not only forms part of the eye socket and the lateral margin of the skull, but is also part of the base of the skull. So a rather complex bone. And let's just continue to rotate around so you get a really good view of the sphenoid. Now let's move towards the front of the skull. And back to the zygomatic arch. Here we're towards the anterior part of the zygomatic arch, and let's click on the bone. And not surprisingly, this is the zygomatic bone. You can see part of it forms the arch. The part of the zygomatic bone forms part of the margin of the eye socket. And if we look into the eye socket, we can see that part of the inside structure of the eye socket is also made from the zygomatic. Let's move further forward, and we can see we have the maxilla. The maxilla has an extension that heads up here and basically heads towards the root of the bony part of the nose. And as we rotate it, you can see the maxilla also forms part of the base of the eye socket and also extends into the first bit of the zygomatic arch. Now, let's click on this bone, and this is the mandible, and we'll just rotate so you can get a good view of the mandible. Now let's go up and look at the small bones that are up here. This often gives students a bit of difficulty, so let's spend a bit of time here. Let's click on the maxilla again so we can see where you are. Now that we've identified the maxilla, let's go to the bone that's in front or anterior. And this is the nasal bone. And here we can see the right nasal bone, and over here we can see the left nasal bone. Great name for it, considering that this forms the major part of the bony bridge of the nose. So far we've identified the nasal bone as we're working our way into the eye socket. Then it was the maxilla. And now we have this other bone. It's actually a fairly small bone. And this is the lacrimal bone. And if you look carefully, you can see that there's a duct, opening for a duct down here. And that's the lacrimal duct. And not surprisingly, this bone takes on the same name. It's the lacrimal bone. If we look a bit further into the eye socket, we can see the ethmoid bone. And I'll just rotate so you can get a sense of it. Now the ethmoid bone is fairly extensive because from here you can see it just looks like part of the eye socket, but if we actually look up in the nasal cavity, you can see that the ethmoid bone is a little larger and extends deeper than it first appears. Let's actually isolate it just so you can get a sense as to its shape. You can see it's complex. You can see that there's a number of sort of sheet-like extensions. And we'll just keep rotating around so you really get a good sense of the shape of the ethmoid. And let's just do the fade option, fade others, so we can see it in place. So you can see, even though at first it looks like a very small bone, it is quite extensive. When it comes to the bones of the skull, there are a number of joints and sutures, but we're going to leave the naming of the joints and sutures for a future video when we come back and look at the joints of the body. Thank you for watching the video, and keep studying.